Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. And perhaps the biggest story, or at least one of the biggest stories we have going on right now, are the tariffs, the on again, off again tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, retaliatory tariffs. I mean, there's so many different names and explanations for these things that I lose count. But I got an economic historian on the show today to talk about it. He is specialist in economic history, especially when it comes to America and the broader Atlantic area. Phillip W. Magness, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I think a good place to start is with mercantilism. What is mercantilism and what is the mercantilist fallacy?
Yeah, so mercantilism was an economic philosophy. It really developed in about the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's the notion that the state, the government, can essentially centrally plan its economy in certain strategic directions by building up certain industries, acting in punitive ways against competitors abroad. And some of the major tools of doing this are both you subsidize the domestic industry at home with government funding and resources and infrastructure improvements, things like that. And then externally, you put up barriers against foreign competitors. Those usually take the form of tariffs, are the most common, and then also controls on the monetary instruments, controls on capital to prevent capital essentially from flowing in a direction that is perceived to be unfavorable. And the stated goal of this type of policy is that a country should try to maximize its trade surplus. It should export more than it imports, and it can get rich by essentially hoarding and directing all the wealth internally and outcompeting the rest of the world as if it's like a zero-sum game.
And the idea that is too, right, that wealth consists of gold and silver.
Essentially, yeah.
Not of products and services.
Right,
it's the amount of gold that you have.
Tangible species. So it's hoard the money at home. So the original iterations of mercantilism, they actually put in controls on capital to where, gold was discovered in the New World and carried back across the ocean. It arrives in Spain, and they put laws in place essentially saying, well, you can't spend this money outside of Spain because we want all the gold here. Therefore, we're the richest. That doesn't really work out all that well, because it starts to actually erode the purchasing power of the money. It's like injecting an expansion of the money supply at home without any ability to legally use it beyond the borders of a country. Well, what happens? The currency devalues.
Yes. So what exactly is a tariff? And maybe more importantly, who actually pays the tariff?
Right. So at its fundamental basis, a tariff is a tax on goods as they cross the border. So it's a tax on imports. And they're one of the oldest forms of taxation. We go back thousands of years, but there's a reason for that. They're among the easiest types of taxes to collect. So if you have a time in history where the technology doesn't exist to collect a tax on every sale, like a consumption tax at the cash register, technology doesn't exist to tax everyone's income, one easy way for the government to raise money is to find the access points to the economy, and those are always the ports. So you can go back thousands of years. Tax collectors would set up in ports because that's where the goods cross a tangible border. It's an easy place to actually collect the money for the government. So in times of very low state capacity, and you see this even today, so a lot of developing countries in Africa, some in the Caribbean, some in Latin America have really high tariffs because they don't have the state capacity to collect taxes in other ways. But that's the simple history of it. But somewhere along the way, people figured out that if you start raising tariffs much higher than the revenue yield that you're trying to go after, you can actually start deflecting and diverting economic consumption away from the international market and toward your domestic producers. You can reward your home industries by taxing their competitors. So you get a second purpose that enters into the tariff equation, and that is to use tariffs as an economic tool to manipulate the economy. And it fits right in with this mercantilist regime. Now, the problem is it's not actually a tax in either case upon the foreign country, even though that's the rhetoric. It says, well, we're taxing goods coming in from abroad, but those goods are destined for the home domestic market, And if you put a tax on it, who's going to pay it? Eventually, it's the buyers of those goods. So even if it's a low revenue tariff, once those goods cross the border, they get a tax slapped on them. The seller will try to transfer and move as much of the tax incidence as they can onto the eventual buyer of the good, no differently than if your local liquor store puts a tax on beer, or if your local gas station puts a tax on cigarettes. Those taxes are not paid for. The incidence of them is not predominantly paid for by the producer. It's actually paid by the person who consumes the product. And the same thing with the tariff.
But initially, it's paid by the importer.
Right.
So if I'm importing beer, that's who pays it initially.
The money's collected there at the border, but the importer is like, okay, well, if I have a 5-cent tax per can of beer, what am I going to do? I'm going to raise the price of beer at the store, and suddenly now the consumer is paying most of that tax for me.
Now, this might get into the weeds a little bit too much, and if it does, that's fine. I'll move on. Sure. But wouldn't it be... I have a pet peeve with that, with the saying passing the price onto the consumer, the cost onto the consumer. The reason being, because it seems to me if supply and demand were such to justify a given price, the seller would already have had the price at that point, because why would he be leaving profits on the table? So it seems to me that what really happens is with the increase in cost on the importing in the form of taxation, you now have less goods, because either they have less money to invest in production, or they just can't afford to bring as much into the country. So you end up with less goods. So so demand hasn't gone up, but supply has gone down. And that's actually why we end up with a higher price. Would that be more economically accurate than this just passing it on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the story, and this is true of any form of taxation. Is taxes are an economic drag. There's an inefficiency just from the simple collection of it, because it means there are less resources to go around. That inefficiency occurs from the shape of the supply and demand curve. We call it deadweight losses. There's one twist on the tariffs, because not only do you have this domestic supply and demand curve with associated deadweight losses, you have another factor in there, and that's called the world price. World prices don't always align with the domestic price of a good, and in many cases, when we import, that means that the world price is trading at a lower level than the domestic price. So goods are crossing borders to make up that gap. And when you put a tax or a tariff in place, what do? You're restricting the import amount. You're squeezing it down. So consumers lose in value. They have no longer have access to cheaper imports. But it's also just a net deadweight drag on the economy, because you have this tax effect. So it's like a double hit here. And then you throw in a third factor that comes into play sometimes when you have lobbying interests that line up because they stand to benefit from the tariff. They'll start diverting their productive resources away from, say, making steel and into trying to sway the government to give them the favorable tariff rate. And that's money that goes out of production and into the hands of politicians and campaign contributions. So you have a rent-seeking loss, essentially, that's created by this whole system.
So historically in the United States, what are some examples of tariffs, and what were their results? And I'm just going to tell you where I'm going with this, is that I've constantly heard this argument that the most prosperous period, or the most extensive growth in American history, took place in the late 1800s, and that's when we had the highest tariffs. Now, I'm going to poison the well maybe a little bit, but the problem with that is that when you make economic arguments, you have to assume all things are equal. All things are never equal. So yes, you might have had higher tariffs, but you had no income tax, you had less regulation. So you have to do an economic analysis in which so you can discern what actually caused the prosperity and what was a drag. So in your view, what are some examples of tariffs, the big ones? I mean, we've always had tariffs, but the bigger ones, and what were the actual economic results of the tariffs?
So we can start with that late 1800s period, because you hear that claim all the time, and I think you hit the nail on the head. They say, well, correlation is not causation. Causation is really hard to discern and tease out. And you'll hear people say, well, we had high tariffs and we were prosperous then, but we also had no income tax. We did not have a central bank. Government spending was a lot smaller as a percentage of GDP than it is today. There's generally less regulation going on. There was more open immigration. All of these other factors, and strangely, they only settle on the tariff as the cause. It just makes absolutely no sense. So what do you do if you want to actually analyze that period? And some of the best economic historians that study it try to tease out causality. Well, if tariffs were really the cause of prosperity, then it stands to reason that the protected industries internal to the U.S. economy should have grown at a faster rate than the non-protected industries in that time. And we know in the late 1800s, there's a huge industrial boom around some brand new industries. One of them is called electricity, electrification. This is never seen up until that point in world history, and then it just explodes everywhere, and America is at the forefront of it. Well, electricity is very hard to protect with tariffs. You look at the data, and it turns out that the electrical industry and many of the services that are connected to it are growing at a much faster rate than, say, like iron and steel, which have these heavy tariffs on top of them. That right there is your first clue that it's probably not the tariffs that are causing growth in that era. And then the second factor you look at, compare that period of high tariffs to other periods of growth in the United States. The other great explosion of wealth, and this is an explosion of wealth that goes in all directions. You get the masses of the population have access to prosperity, is the post-World War II boom after 1945. And that coincides with a continuous and concerted effort to reduce tariffs. So if tariffs are the driver of prosperity, one, it doesn't quite fit the 1880s, 1890s story when you have other industries that are not beneficiaries of tariffs that are booming at even faster rate. And two, it doesn't fit the post-World War II story when tariffs are being reduced, and yet there's a huge boom in prosperity.
Now, I want to get to Trump's tariffs specifically, right? Well, before we get to Trump's, I want to ask you about Smoot-Hawley.
Yeah.
Right? The Smoot-Hawley tariffs, how instrumental do you think they were in exacerbating the Great Depression, specifically the unemployment problem during the Great Depression?
Yeah. So Smoot-Hawley is a tricky question to discern exactly where its effects are economically. But you ask the consensus of the entire economics profession, and practically everyone agrees it made the Depression worse. So we can start with that baseline. I don't think there's anyone that's a reasonable, reputable economic historian or economist even that thinks Smoot-Hawley was a good idea. And they knew that at the time. But so Smoot-Hawley originates in late 1929. So the stock market crashes. There are signs of economic problems on the horizon, very clear signs. And one of the theories that existed at the time, the way that you did a stimulus package was to protect the domestic economy. You erect tariff barriers against the rest of the world, and that at least insulates you and allows your home industry to weather the storm. That's what the Republican Party believed at the time. This is an old argument going all the way back to Henry Clay in the 1820s made it, and that had been a part of their protectionist mercantilist philosophy.
Doesn't it even go back to Hamilton?
It does. Clay is the one that injects it in on steroids.
Okay.
So Hamilton is a protectionist, and he kind of lays out the theory. Henry Clay in 1824 is the guy that coins it as an economic system and basically appoints himself as Hamilton's heir. So this had been in the air around the protectionist side of policy for most of the 19th century. And you see when the Republican Party was in control, they were traditionally the protectionist party of the time. They would respond to recessions and depressions by erecting tariff barriers. So 1929 comes along, stock market crashes, and they said, we're going to go back to our old formula of protective tariffs, and that'll weather the storm. What it does is it actually backfires. Backfires in a couple different ways simultaneously. First, it's an economic drag. It turns into like a free-for-all of every special interest group descending on Washington, D.C. to get favorable rates to insulate them from competition. And, when that happens, it's basically like a race to the bottom. So you get this bloated, special interest laden bill that emerges from the committees in the House and Senate and is signed into law in 1930. The second thing it does is it infuriates all of our foreign trading partners. The United Kingdom and Germany and Canada and France And everywhere else in the world that we had major commercial streams to look at us, and they look at the United States and they say, well, if you're going to put a tariff on us, we're going to retaliate. We're going to put a tariff back on you. Because this is their only strategy in that kind of a zero-sum game, race to the bottom. So it ignites a retaliatory trade war. And then in short order, in about 4 years, it cuts the volume of international trade to basically about a fourth of its pre-depression level. So this is a problem in itself. There's already a destruction of wealth that's taken place by the eruption of this trade war. And that's where I think most historians of the Great Depression, that's where most economists come to agreement and say, yes, Smoot-Hawley was like throwing gasoline in this raging fire. It collapsed international trade. Some of us go a little bit further, though, and I'm generally in this camp, and we ask the question, okay, well, what did the United States export at the time? What were the major goods we sold abroad that were targeted and harmed by these punitive retaliatory tariffs caused by this trade war? It turns out it's a lot of agriculture. It's grains, it's wheat, it's corn. It was the breadbasket of America shipped food goods to the rest of the world, and then suddenly they're targeted in retaliatory tariffs, plus an overlaid collapse in international trade. Now start to do some thinking. What do you know about the history of the Great Depression? Where do some of the bank crises emerge from? They're farmers that can no longer pay their mortgage. And other farmers find out their neighbor can no longer pay their mortgage. Then there are runs on banks in the Midwest. Well, why can't they pay their mortgage? Because their entire export industry had been obliterated by this tariff and trade war. So it ends up being like a domino effect, a cascading effect across the country with secondary and tertiary implications in addition to this initial hit from the tax. And it turns out, you start thinking about it in that way, Smoot-Hawley has long, steep repercussions well beyond the initial economic hit. It basically puts the country into a bind that it's impossible to recover from without dismantling the tariff system.
Okay, so now we have Trump, right? And one of the things I keep hearing, from Trumpsters is reciprocal tariffs. Now, I've read probably 50 economics books. I've never come across this term before, reciprocal tariff. I don't know if he made it up or if it's an actual thing or what, but what can you tell us about Trump's tariffs? What is their avowed purpose? I know there's a few. And what do you think will be the likely result?
Yeah, so the reciprocity argument, this comes out of trade law. And that's where he picked up the term, but he doesn't really seem to understand the term, because if you go back and things like the Trade Act of 1974 and some of its precursors, they actually had formulas for what they call reciprocity, and this is the way that the legal structures are made around trade agreements. That if a country abroad attacks the U.S. with a tariff or does something in violation of one of those agreements, it allows formulas to calculate a return rate to be placed within the permissible bounds of that agreement and vice versa. So that's the notion of where this comes from. But the way Trump views it is he actually sent his economic team, and I don't know who did this because they seem to be afraid and are ashamed to put their name on it, but they came up with this complete crackpot formula of what they call reciprocity, but it's really just making up numbers out of thin air. And what they do is in the numerator, they take the trade deficit, the bilateral trade deficit the United States has between us and that one other country, which, there's already a problem with this approach because most trade isn't strictly bilateral. It's multilateral. It involves goods coming from multiple different places. So it's really not a good indicator of anything. So they take the trade deficit and they put that in the numerator, and then in the denominator they just divide that by the import volume, and they put all these Greek letters in there that were supposed to make it look like a fancy scientific mathematical formula. But some of us investigated this formula when it first popped up, and it turns out the Greek letters simply multiply the number 4 by 1/4, which equals 1. So it cancels each other out. And instead what you really have is this trade deficit divided by imports, which is this nonsensical, meaningless formula that comes up with all these crazy haywire numbers at almost an ad hoc whim on every country in the world that he targeted. And they released this list And, the economics profession's reading over this. First, we scratch our heads. Then we figure out how stupid this formula was that came up. And it's like, this is crazy. It just has no basis in any form of economic analysis. And, if I were a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, I would resign in shame tomorrow that this was put out under my name. This is embarrassing. This is like NASA being invaded by astrologers who are using moon cycles and planetary alignment to decide when we're going to a good day to launch a satellite into orbit. It's just bonkers that this was adopted, and yet that's where we're at.
What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to recover from this, or are we just going to keep spiraling?
Yeah. So there are a couple repercussions that are already underway. First, the market abhors this. We've seen it in the stock market. It's the seesaw effect. Every time Trump threatens or repeals or threatens again, every time that it looks like we're getting more tariffs, the market crashes. And this is like direct, precise, acutely attributable to the fact that this policy is being pursued because anyone and everyone that engages in industrial production, trading, manufacturing, you name it, they know that they use raw materials and parts that come from abroad. So Trump says, hey, we're building up the domestic industrial base. No, in fact, he's shooting the domestic industrial base in the foot by these tariffs by cutting them off from the raw material suppliers and part suppliers abroad. You want to hurt the U.S. auto industry? We'll tax the things that the parts and components and materials that are used in auto production. That's worse than anything you could do to any company abroad. But that's the reality of it. So the market abhors tariffs, and we're starting to see those signals. The second thing, these policies are extremely unpopular. If you look at the opinion surveys, Trump entered office in January with generally a net positive on his economic handling. People were sick and tired of the Biden-Harris era of inflation, of rising prices, of big government. And they thought, hey, maybe Trump, at least, whether I agree or disagree with his other policies, he is going to at least pursue a free market course that will give us some economic relief. Those numbers are now in the negative. They flipped in the course of just 3 months. And if you ask people why, it's because of the tariff anxiety. Tariffs poll terribly, consistently, over and over. Polls that have been given in the last 1 to 2 weeks, I'll say between 55 and 60% of Americans hate these things, hate these policies. All walks of life hate these policies because it means we're going to be paying higher prices at the grocery store, at the hardware store, at the car dealership. And in some cases, it also means that people are going to lose jobs, or that their sectors are going to be hard, or that their small business is going to now be taxed because it has goods it brings in from abroad. So the economic repercussions are real, they're being felt, and these things are plummeting in popularity. If you also decipher the polls, even dig down a little deeper, it turns out that the only people that support these are a really, really small, a tiny, diehard MAGA base of about 15 to 20%. That always exists. There's a base on the far right and a base on the far left. No matter who's in office, that person will always have a core of 15 or 20%. But those are the only people that seem to want tariffs. And Trump is catering his economic agenda, his entire economic agenda around that at a time that markets are responding very negatively. He is unfortunately setting himself up to be obliterated at the midterms in 2026. Voters are not going to reward this policy. They're already soured on it. And, if we think we have another year and a half of this, we could be pushed into a recession. And that's basically political suicide. Now,
this idea that they base their tariffs on deficits stems from the idea that trade deficits are bad.
Right.
Are trade deficits bad? Even, the argument is, well, no, but sustained deficits are bad. So I want the most sustained of deficits, the most extreme of deficits, trade deficits, that is, are they harmful to our well-being?
No, and quite the contrary. A trade deficit is a mistaken reading of an accounting sheet. Because it implies that if you take their logic to the extreme end that they run with, it sounds like the world is basically like just giving us stuff, giving us money for free, and I don't think that makes any economic sense to view that as a negative. So the reality of trade is it's a two-way street. We get something from abroad, we pay for it. We ship something abroad, somebody else pays us in return. And if you only measure that in physical goods, you're missing a big part of the equation. First off, you're missing services that transfer across borders. And it turns out in quite a few cases, the United States has a service surplus with many countries. Another component, you have remittances and financial instruments and dollars that are changing hands across borders. And if you do an accurate accounting of this, you add up all sides of the balance sheet, by definition, the balance is zero. Because nobody's giving anything away for free or getting anything for free. It's just a different instrument that's being offered in return. And this is a sign of a robust international economy. Now, there's a question that comes up about the sustained trade deficits, and we have had trade deficits for roughly continuously for about 40 years. But this is a reflection of the fact that the dollar is the global reserve currency. That is viewed as a vote of confidence in the strength of the dollar. It's a reliable instrument of exchange. Up until very recently, it was viewed as being pretty soundproof and stuff against inflation and some of the other problems that cause other currencies to not be viewed as reliable, to collapse, essentially. There are many other countries abroad that have dollarized or in various ways pegged their own currencies to the US dollar as a vote of confidence in its stability. And what we have here, when Trump is pursuing a policy to supposedly reverse the trade deficit, first he has some internal incoherences here, because tariffs actually strengthen the position of the dollar, all else considered, abroad by basically making U.S. goods more expensive. But vis-a-vis that, he's trying to do some currency manipulations to weaken the value of the dollar to counteract this. All it's really doing is breeding financial uncertainty and monetary uncertainty that eventually, we're going to start seeing this. Some of it's already started to appear on treasury auctions and in the bond markets. Other countries are looking elsewhere for different possibilities of a base currency unit to use for global exchange. And as a result of this, he's playing with fire here is a good way to put it.
What about the argument that these other countries are all putting tariffs on American products coming into their countries, and so it's not fair trade, so we need to put tariffs on to sort of level the field? First of all, do all other countries, as I've heard stated, have higher tariffs on us than we have on them? And why not just go to zero tariffs regardless of what they do?
Yeah, so that argument that's been made, and it's baffling because it has no basis in reality, period. The way that they do this, so they look at other countries abroad, and we've all heard this over the last few weeks. Well, if tariffs are so bad, why do other countries put them on us?
Oh, that's the dumbest argument I've ever heard in my life. Oh my God, the logical incoherence is insane.
It's completely incoherent. So the sheer reality of it is, among developed nations, major trading partners in the developed world, the United States actually has the highest average tariff rate compared to our major trading partners. We are above the European Union. We have higher average tariff rates than Canada. And this is before Trump. Now,
that's what I was getting ready to ask.
Yeah, before Trump. So go back to December 2024, the United States has a higher average tariff rate on Canada, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Australia. All of these major trading partners we have abroad is roughly in the same territory as China, which is a up-and-coming developing nation. But the countries that had higher tariffs than the United States, they tend to fall into two categories. One, they tend to be underdeveloped or developing countries with very weak state capacity. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, a lot of countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America that simply don't have a means to collect taxes internally, so they do it at the border. And those tend to have low but stable average tariff rates in 5 or 6%. But the other category, all the economic basket cases of the world, Venezuela, Cuba, places that have dysfunctional governments, have astronomical tariff rates in 15 or 20% territory. And there are some estimates that now Trump is pushing us into that territory where we move from being like slightly higher than Canada, slightly higher than the EU, to now we're ranked like just behind Equatorial Guinea and worse than Venezuela, which is just astounding to me. It's like, make America Venezuela again or something is the type of policy being pursued here. So this argument is just complete specious nonsense. They do a sleight of hand here because what they'll notice is they'll say, well, Canada collects a 200% dairy tariff on the United States. They'll single out one item that's like the exception to the rule. And every country has these weird exceptions. Why? Because they have crony internal domestic interests that have lobbied for carve-outs. And the Canadian dairy industry, yes, it's terrible. They put extremely high tariff rates on the United States. And you say, well, that's unfair. Well, I'd say anyone who's concerned about the unfairness of that, look to the United States sugar industry, because we do the same thing. We have 150 and 200% post-quota tariffs on sugar to protect our domestic industry. So we're offenders in the same way. The ideal for the world would be to eliminate these few remaining carve-outs, get everyone down to 0% tariffs. And we're very, very close to that prior to Trump coming along. Most other major trading partners had extremely low average tariff rates. And, you're talking between 0.5 and 1.5% average tariff rate. That's next to nothing. It's virtually non-existent, and it's been moving in that direction for the better part of a century. And now he's reversed it, and not only reversed it, done so unilaterally in a way that's triggered a trade war.
And it seems like he's not only done this, implemented tariffs, which is dumb, but he does it in a very dumb way. The tariffs are on, the tariffs are off. We're going to negotiate. So you have all this uncertainty.
Yeah.
So people can't even plan, right? Like I can't even say, okay, now I can factor this in to my business cost. Now I know how much to buy, where to invest, whatever. They don't even know how to do that. Like, how bad is the market uncertainty going to be for investors?
And that's one of the worst parts of it. And you're already seeing reports of this, that international supply chains are being disrupted. It's being compared to what happened during COVID because of the shutdowns. But we're doing it to ourselves again. We're doing an economic shutdown. And think about it this way. Suppose you're a manufacturer in the United States and you need raw aluminum in your product. And your entire production line planning for the next year is dependent on the price of aluminum. Well, Trump is essentially saying you don't know what aluminum is going to be a week from now, let alone 6 months from now. Do you rush and put your orders in now before the tariffs take effect? Well, suddenly the tariffs have taken effect. Now those raw material inputs that are coming from abroad are a much higher price. That changes your entire production equation. What if you are banking on the idea that maybe Trump is just bluffing and he's going to back down like some of his defenders have said? Well, then you try to wait it out, and then it turns out he doesn't back down. This is when you get a market shock. So the uncertainty itself is just a recipe for economic chaos. It's a recipe for economic stagnation. And the end game of it, as this continues on for several weeks or even months on end, it means that producers just start behaving in more and more cautious ways. They start laying off employees when they are expecting, they're going to have to scale back on production. They start hoarding money, holding it in the bank rather than taking a new business risk where there's a good chance that the price could change of a major raw material input 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 6 months from now.
Has anyone called you a commie yet for opposing tariffs?
That's a fascinating thing. Yes, they have. If you look at the diehard pro-tariff protectionist Twitter, they say, I've been espousing the principles of Frederick Hayek and Milton Friedman, those two notorious communists, and espousing the principles of free trade of Adam Smith, another notorious communist. And I'm told because I'm contradicting the Trump tariff agenda, I too must be a communist like Hayek, Friedman, and Smith.
Yes. Once you oppose Trump, you're a commie.
That's the odd thing. And even weirder, if you actually look line by line, compare Trump's tariff agenda The closest thing it resembles is like the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders tariff agenda of around 2016.
Yeah, they were talking about fair trade.
Exactly. And protecting American industries against foreign competition. That was the Bernie Sanders agenda when he ran for president, and somehow Trump has co-opted it, called it his own, and now his followers, who know nothing of history, know nothing of the principles or articulated economic reasoning behind this policy, they see it and they just nod in agreement, and everyone else who opposes it must be a communist.
The other day, I'll share this and then I'll get your information and let you go. The other day, I posted something about Trump. I don't remember what it was now. And a guy comes in and the guy says to me, he says, why don't you just wait and see how these policies pan out and then judge? And I said, well, anybody who has a smattering of understanding of economics, politics, philosophy, and history knows how it's going to pan out.
That's exactly.
But then he comes and he says, well, everybody was happy last time. And everybody, I said, he had a 41% approval rating. What do you mean everybody was happy? Exactly. And then he comes back and he says, I don't want to argue about politics. Well, then you shouldn't have chimed in. But that is the level of discourse you end up with the, everyone who hates Trump is a commie. Or even if you just don't hate him, you just disagree with him, you're a commie. It's a very, very scary time for me, because a lot of these dangerous things, the tribalism, the breakdown of our information systems, they all seem to just coalescing at once. And it's a very scary time for me. I mean, it's a scary time for a lot of people. I think it's a very scary time.
Yeah, and it's a complete rejection of rationality that we see at play here. I've seen this myself. I'm not a never Trumper. I'm not a pro Trumper either. If Trump does something that I agree with and I like, I will praise him. If he cuts taxes and finds a way to bring spending down, please, I'd praise any president that did that. If, on the other hand, he raises my taxes, which tariffs are doing, and pushes the world economy into a recession, then he deserves criticism for that. That's how politicians should be evaluated, not just the team or the tribe they're on. Let's look at the actual policies they're doing. And, exactly as you note, we know tariffs are bad now, not only from the signs, we're already seeing the market judgment against them, but hello, Smoot-Hawley was a disaster. We've been down this route before. We've tried it, and that was at a time at a much less integrated global economy. So this thing has the potential, if he continues it, to be Smoot-Hawley on steroids for a much larger globalized economy. And you start doing that, it becomes the mechanism that drives us into a recession for, we could be talking years of economic pain and stagnation and harm, all for self-inflicted reasons. And that's the badness of it. There's no reason to do this. There's no economic case to do it, no diplomatic case to do it, no popular will to do it. They're just pursuing it from like a misguided fancy at the moment. And, the harms are real. How do I tell the person who got laid off from their job at the car manufacturing plant because the price of steel and aluminum went up due to tariffs? Just wait it out and we'll see what happens. That's their livelihood.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's we've already talked about it. All right, so tell people where they can find you.
So I write at independent.org, which is the Independent Institute, and you also find me on Twitter at Phillip W. Magness, and post a lot of my commentaries there, and just generally out and about in the media. I continue to be fighting this tariff issue probably for the foreseeable future, which is weird because as an economic historian, this is what I studied, 19th century tariffs. I did my dissertation on this issue, never dreamed it was going to be back again. And yet here we are.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to explain the issue to us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.